Welcome to the Catholic Contribution with me, John Haldane. This is the fifth and final talk in this series, and its topic is Catholic anthropology and Catholic education. So let me begin by drawing a distinction between two ways in which the word anthropology is used, and I'm only really going to be concerned with the second of them, though in a way it's the less familiar. So, first of all, one's most likely to encounter the word anthropology in a university setting as perhaps the name of a department, certainly as the name of a subject. So anthropology, as it's used in that context and in textbooks, the sort of thing, if you saw a book in a bookstore with the title anthropology, this is the sort of thing it would lead you into. Anthropology in this sense describes an academic subject. It has a particular history. It really begins in the 19th century, and it's related to ethnography, which is the study of peoples, and in particular, the study of peoples unfamiliar to one. It has its origins in some ways in exploration and traveling. Explorers and travelers would encounter, obviously their curiosity is about new lands, unfamiliar lands, and so on. And so they would encounter peoples whose ways of life seemed very different from what they were familiar with. And often they would just write these up as sort of travelers' accounts, observe certain practices and so on. But this became more systematic and led to the practice of ethnography, to the studies of peoples and their practices. And anthropology as we have it today really takes two forms. There are field studies in which people go out and they will study the practices of a community. It needn't, by the way, necessarily be a remote community, though it might often be that, but it could be, say, for example, a working class community in the inner city of a deindustrialized town or something of that sort, the center of a deindustrialized town, looking at the social practices that bind those people together, the challenges they face, and so on. Anthropology, in its origins in the 19th century, in travelers, explorers, and such like, was connected, for obvious reasons, with things like empire and colonialism, because it was natural that people of the imperial country or of the colonial country had this opportunity to go and explore. Sometimes they would go there for work or for trade or whatever else it may be. And so it had originally an association that people were a bit uncomfortable with. But as the years have passed, it's largely purged itself of that. And so these days anthropologists don't seem to be carrying on the business of colonialism in any way. Indeed, on the contrary, they tend to be very strongly anti-colonial. Now, having introduced the most familiar use of the term anthropology, I want to contrast with it the thing that I'm interested in when I talk about Catholic anthropology. What I'm concerned with is something rather different. And the best way to introduce it is by observing uses in English of the word man. Now, it happens to be the case that in English and in a number of other modern languages, that the word, in this case, I'll just stick with English. The word the word man is ambiguous between three uses referring to different things. By man, you can mean adult human being. A man came into the room, meaning an adult human being, not a child, but a man. Not a boy, but a man. You might mean a human being in general. The question might be, could a man lift this? Might mean, or is this medicine any good for a man? Doesn't mean for a male, a human being. It means for a human being in general. And the third use of the term man is to refer to humanity. And you can only work out by context which use of man is intended. Now, as it turns out, in Hebrew and in Greek and in Latin, there are distinct words for each of these three. So they don't have to just live with a single word, and so the ambiguities that would arise from the use of that. Sometimes, for example, people will say, it's obvious that in these ancient writings they privilege men, meaning the male. But actually often that's a confusion resulting from the translation of a word for humanity or human being in general by the word man, which doesn't in that context actually mean male necessarily. So in Greek and Latin, for example, and also, as I say, in Hebrew, there are separate words that can be used for each of these. And the word in Greek is anthropos. And from that, of course, we get things like a philanthropist, a lover of humanity, a lover of human beings in that way. So anthropos covers both male and female. Now, interestingly, if we look at Genesis, the name Adam is sometimes not used as a name, but sometimes used to refer in each of those senses that I spoke of. But as I say, Hebrew actually does have different terms for each. But if we look at the New Testament in particular, and at the writings of St. Paul, it's quite interesting to look at what word he uses in particular contexts. So, for example, let's take the first letter to the Corinthians, where there has evidently, we don't have the letter from the Corinthians, but evidently some anxiety has developed among the particular church at Corinth, among the Christians at Corinth, about what happens to people when they die. It had been assumed that the second coming of Jesus would occur within the lifetimes of the first generation of Christians. But of course, people then were dying off and they're wondering what's going to happen. So they write to Paul, and Paul responds by talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And what he's saying to them is, look, we've seen the future. The future is that we will follow Jesus into death, but we'll be raised up. Now, the second coming might arise at a time when some people are still alive, and so it will be the case that those people never died. But many people will die, and we don't know when the second coming is going to arrive. And so we should assume that people will die. But in assuming that they die, we shouldn't despair, because we have the example of Jesus. And so he writes, as in Adam all men died, so in Christ are all men raised up again, the first fruits of those who are to be raised. Now, if we look at the Greek here, the word that he uses for men is anthropo. So it's when he says, as in Adam all men died, he doesn't mean all adult male human beings died. He means all human beings, or humanity as it were, died. But in Christ is raised up again. And this is part of Paul's preoccupation, actually, with the idea that the death and resurrection of Christ reveals a kind of second Adam, a new kind of humanity, or we might say a restoration of humanity to the status that it enjoyed prior to the fall. So when I talk about Catholic anthropology, I'm talking about anthropology in this sense, the attempt to understand the nature of the human. What kind of being is the human being? Now, if we reflect on that, there seem to be four answers. And the question is, are these all compatible with one another? Do they pull apart? Should we give priority to one over the other, and so on? The first thing we might say about human beings is that they're physical objects. We know that. I mean, they have a certain mass, a certain weight, a certain density. We know that they respond in different ways to heat, to cold, and such like. So they're physical objects like other physical objects. But secondly, they're kinds of animals. So some physical objects are inanimate, but some are animate. And we're among the animate ones. We're kinds of animals. But thirdly, we are also persons. That is to say, we're personal beings. We're centers of consciousness. We're moral beings. We reflect, we decide, we act, we have purposes, we have goals, we have hopes, we have fears. We're personal beings. And fourthly, we seem to be spiritual beings. That is to say, we seem to be oriented towards transcendence. Animals obviously have their needs that they seek to satisfy. Human beings, like animals, have needs that they seek to satisfy. But among the needs that human beings seem to have are spiritual needs. In his Confessions, St. Augustine at one point says, "You made us for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless until they come to rest in you." And what Augustine is talking about there is a commonly felt restlessness, that human beings seem never to be satisfied with things that they have, even personal relationships, because those are prey to death, to misfortune, to loss, to abandonment, and so on. And so there is a craving for something else. And Augustine diagnoses that as our craving for God. It's a desire to return to God. So if we're interested in trying to understand the nature of human beings, what sort of methods might we use to discover this? Well, obviously the answer to that is many different ones. Some will refer to our nature as physical beings, some to our nature as kinds of animals, some to our natures as persons, and some to our natures as spiritual beings. But in general, there's a principle that we can deploy in this, and it's a general principle of Aristotelian philosophy. It's expressed in the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and other figures of the Middle Ages with the principle that acting follows upon being, or put another way, as a thing is, so it acts. So the idea here is that there is an intimate relationship between the activities of an entity and the powers that those activities express and the nature of an entity. In fact, you might even go further and say that an entity is a collection of powers and capacities. What it is in a sense the kinds of things that it naturally does. So if we want to find out what human beings are, then we have to investigate their activities and distinguish among the activities those that express their essential powers, and on the basis of an understanding of those powers, build up a picture of their nature. So if we return to the four aspects that I've already mentioned, we know that human beings are physical objects, but in a way that's the least interesting thing about them, because that's what they share with everything else. If you were going to do a physics of the human body, you wouldn't be investigating or discovering anything particular about human bodies, just about material bodies. Likewise, if you look at it at us as a kind of animal, you will discover our different animal powers, the powers of vegetation, digestion. By vegetation, I simply mean growth. By digestion, sensation, locomotion, the ability to move from one place to another. But again, in that case, you're discovering our powers as animals, powers that we share with others, but they're not distinctive of us as human beings. They're possessed by us as human beings, but they're not our distinguishing characteristics. It's really when you start to move in the direction of our nature as persons, and then beyond that, more especially to our nature as spiritual beings, that the distinctive nature of human beings begins to emerge. So if we look at our nature as persons and think about the activities that are expressive of that, well, there are things like consciousness, there's thought, there's deliberation, but there are also personal relationships, the ways in which persons engage with one another. And more than merely engage with one another, the extent to which they depend upon one another. And not just for practical matters, not just, as it were, for food or protection and so on, but that actually we develop as persons in communion with others. That our relationship with others is not merely, as it were, a circumstantial or accidental one. It seems to be constitutive of our very nature, that we share our being, our personal being, in community with others. Hence the importance of things like personal relationships, family relationships, community relationships, and so on. These seem not simply to be something that gets added on to our personal being, they seem to be essential to it. And so somebody who is deprived of those is somebody whose personal being is diminished. And then if we try to discover and explore something of our nature as spiritual beings, well, we have to look at the activities that are expressive of that nature. What would those be? Well, there'll be activities in which there seems to be a quest for transcendence, in which we seem to reach out for values that somehow extend beyond time and space. Now, those might be, for example, aesthetic values. So Plato, for instance, argues that our interest in natural beauty is really an interest in a kind of beauty that goes beyond nature. It's an interest in the ideal, in the perfect. And so while we look at a landscape, of course we're looking at something material, but it's as if, as it were, we're trying to see through that landscape to something ideal, something perfect, of which it is an intimation. Or again, take the idea of the sublime, the sense of, as it were, looking at the stars and feeling, as it were, their grandeur. This seems to be an indication, a symbol in some way, of a transcendent grandeur that somehow we're fitted for. course, a Christian is going to say that is the grandeur of the kingdom of God. So, in trying to understand ourselves, we need to look at our activities and see which among these activities are expressive of our distinctive powers, and on the basis of having identified those distinctive powers, build up a picture of the nature of the human being as such. And that's what a Catholic anthropology, in the sense in which I'm using that, is concerned with. Now, when we look at Catholic contributions, historically, they fall into two broad camps. So on the one hand, there's a sort of dualist picture, and on the other, there's what I'm going to call an animist picture, but I'm using animist in a special way, not the usual way in which it might be used. So, with regard to dualism, the picture is pretty clear. This goes back to Plato. It's the idea that we're really not one being, we're two beings. We're a spiritual being, or a mental being, or a personal being, maybe those are distinct, maybe those are the same, housed in a physical being. So what you're seeing just now is not me, but the body in which I reside. And somehow, from the inside, as it were, so to speak, I operate this body. So the gestures, my hands, my voice, and so on, these are really not me speaking, but the instrument speaking. That behind all of these is the person or the soul. And that dualistic picture is intelligible in one way, because what Plato is observing is that there just seems to be a very marked difference between personal being and bodily being. And the only way in which he can really make sense of that is by saying, well, really, these are two beings. So what we call a human person is actually two things conjoined, a body and a soul. Now, Plato's principal student, Aristotle, wasn't going to have any of that. He thought that really didn't make any sense at the end of the day. But he didn't deny, however, that there were aspects of us that went beyond our materiality. He just thought that we needed to give an account of that didn't end up with the conclusion that we're really two things. He wanted to preserve the unity and the integrity of the human being. And his view is what I'm calling animism. This is not the standard way of using this word, and it's not generally used in relation to Aristotle, but I think for these purposes it might be quite convenient. It's short, like dualism. But what I mean by animism is that we are animated bodies. We are bodies that are alive and active as persons, and indeed as spiritual beings, through a kind of form of organization, that we are empowered with a kind of life. Now, this life resides in our bodies. It animates and activates our bodies. It's not another thing, but it is a special kind of power. So, as human beings, we are alive, not just in the sense in which animals are alive, but we are personally alive, and we are spiritually alive. And we show this life of the soul, not as a separate thing, but as what we are, this embodied, incarnated soul. And we have to be careful, because embodied sounds like a soul in a body, but I think incarnated is perhaps a better term here. This living animal being, we show that its personal character and its spiritual character through its activities and through its strivings. So in Christian thinking more broadly, in the Christian traditions over the centuries, there have been advocates of dualism, as I described it, and advocates of what I'm calling, at any rate, animism. Now, I think that in the 19th century particularly, most Christians were kinds of dualists. And I think this was partly connected with the interest in psychical research and in the fascination with ghosts and spirits and so on. And so, in the 19th century, for example, some people conducted experiments in which they would weigh people's bodies who they knew were dying. They'd weigh their bodies before they died, and they'd weigh their bodies after they died, and they'd try to see if there was any difference. And if there were, they'd attribute that to the departure of the soul from the body. Actually, this doesn't quite make sense, because if there were a weight difference, that would show that the soul was itself a material object, something that had some weight. But at any rate, you can see what they were thinking. They were thinking that the only way of making sense of us as human beings is to see us as souls in bodies. Now, as I say, the animist tradition, as I'm calling it that, is somewhat different. It says that no, we have bodies, but we're not reducible to our bodies. We're animated, living, personal, spiritual beings. That our activities involve our bodies, but transcend our bodies. Now, what view you take on that issue, as between these two views, is going to bear on the question as to what idea you have about the possibility of a future life. So many Christians have thought that the future life begins at death, that at death the soul leaves the body and then it goes off, and then there's some story to be told about an immediate judgment, and then it's either consigned to heaven or to purgatory or to hell, or whatever the story is there. The details of that for these purposes don't matter. The point is that you shuffle off this mortal coil and then you go on into an eternal existence. Your soul endures eternally. It existed before you died, but through death it's freed from the body and it continues to exist eternally. On the what I've called the animist view, the picture is going to be a little different. It's going to say you're not reducible to your body, you're more than your body, but nonetheless, to have a life, you need a body. And so it's going to say the possibility of a full human life is going to depend on resurrection. And that's why Paul is very interesting, because Paul is a strong advocate of this view, that our hope for a future life depends upon resurrection. And when Thomas Aquinas writes his commentary on Paul's letter on Corinthians, he says, anima mea non est ego, my soul is not I, and goes on to say that if only soul survived, neither I nor any other person would live again. So St. Thomas does think that something survives death, but it's not the person. And so the prospect of personal life depends upon bodily life. And so he claims, with Paul, that at some point in the future we will be resurrected. And this is a very interesting picture. And of course, Paul is inspired here by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he uses a phrase in his letter, Paul in his letter, he says, you ask with what body shall we be raised? He says, oh, you foolish men, do you not know that what is sown in dishonor is raised in glory? And then he says, it will be with a spiritualized body. The phrase is soma pneumatikon, a spiritual body, or a spiritualized, spirit-inspired body. Now, this is a slightly mysterious notion, but it's clear that what Paul had in mind was the resurrected Jesus. That Jesus, as he appeared to the apostles, in some respects had the characteristics of an ordinary human bodily being, but in other respects not. And so Paul is hinting that the idea that the resurrected body will not be quite an ordinary body, but nonetheless it will be bodily life. And I think that's a very important aspect of trying to understand the Catholic tradition, because the Catholic tradition, the official Catholic tradition, the defined Catholic position and in creeds, involves this resurrectional element. I look forward to the resurrection of the dead, et expecto resurrectionem et mortem. Look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come, vitam venturi seculi, the life of the world to come. So the Catholic view is a resurrectionist view, and the resurrectionist view goes with the animist view. Now, in thinking about what we are as human beings, we also have to look back to Genesis. Because what we learn in Genesis is that every human being is an image of God, imago Dei. Well, what does that mean? Well, I think part of what it means is that, like God, we are beings that have reason and we're agents. But I think it's more than that. I think that it's this idea of us being spiritual beings, that we are made for eternity. And how that's developed in the Catholic understanding is that we're made to enjoy a kind of participation in the life of God. Not as God, we're not merged into God, we don't become God, but the future life for us is one in which we share in some way, proportionate to our nature, in the divine life. And quite what that means, we talk about the beatific vision, but quite what that means, we really don't know. But nonetheless, it is absolutely critical to the Catholic understanding of the human person that the human person is made for eternity and made for companionship with God. So against that background of what we might mean by Catholic anthropology, how we might study that, and what its content might be, leading up to and including what I've been saying about the life of the soul, the life, the destiny that awaits us, bodily resurrection, and so on. Obviously, a great deal more to be said about those matters. But even just holding what we have in place, what are the implications of this for Catholic education? Well, first of all, I want to draw a distinction between Catholic ideas about education and ideas about Catholic education. Now, I draw this distinction for a particular reason. Catholicism, unlike certain religious views, is not a sectarian faith. Now, I'm using sectarian here in a technical sense. I come from Scotland. In Scotland, we have the problem of sectarianism. That really refers to bigotry, a hostility between one religious group and another, particularly between those of Protestant ancestry and those of Catholic ancestry, particularly immigrant Irish and so on. So people talk about sectarianism. That's not the use of a sect that I have in mind. By a sect, I mean a group of people brought together by shared commitments and so on, who see their faith practice and their beliefs as oriented towards their salvation. So a sect, in this sense, has nothing to say about the rest of the world. And there's a connection between this notion of a sect, and here I'm not using this at all in any derogatory sense. It's not like a sect in the sense of a cult or something of that sort. I'm defining it as a group of believers who've come together, and the purpose of their common fellowship, of their life together, religious life together, is for the salvation of themselves and their families, if they have families. This notion of a sect has certain implications. It's also, as I was just about to say, is also related, interestingly, to the Abrahamic covenant and the issue that felt by Jews that, well, look, God's relationship is with us. What is to be our concern for the rest of the world? And it's a feature of Judaism that it's resistant to making converts. It doesn't see itself as an evangelical belief, a faith, going out to try to make converts and so on. Somehow the Gentiles will find their way to God through the example of faithful Jews and so on. But it isn't concerned to try to sort of draw them in as Jews. And we saw in talking about the first century of the Christian church and the Council of Jerusalem, that debate about whether or not to be a Christian you first had to become a Jew if you weren't already one, and so on. And what was settled in Catholicism is that Catholicism is not a sect. It's not about the salvation exclusively of its members. It's about the salvation of the world. That the task for the Catholic is to cooperate with God in his work of redemption and salvation. And so from that point of view, a Catholic thinking about education should really have two sets of ideas. Ideas about Catholic education, but also Catholic ideas about education in general. Because education is something that should concern the Catholic not just for his or her own sake, but as it were for the sake of the world, as part of that salvific work. So if we look at the history of thinking about these matters, what we find is that there are two kinds of contributions. There are the contributions of Catholics to ideas about education in general, and then, of course, there are ideas about Catholic education, the content of education for Catholics. Let me just say something briefly about the first of those. In the 16th century, there began to be a systematic development of the idea of schools. We have to be aware of the fact that for not only most of human history in general, but in most of the last 2,000 years, no such things as schools existed, or such schools as existed only existed for a tiny percentage of the population. But with the development of the cities, with urbanization, with the growth of populations, with the importance of literacy developing and so on, so with that there developed ideas about the founding and establishment of schools, and in doing that you'd think about what you were going to teach in them. Now, in thinking about that, a number of Catholics, prominently Jesuits but not exclusively so, looked back to the traditions of Rome and of Greece, but particularly of Rome, and the development of a curriculum. And so they came up with certain ideas about what subjects ought to be taught and in what order they ought to be taught. And some of these principles are very interesting and remain relevant to the present day. So, for example, there's a debate as to whether you should start with the general and proceed towards the particular. So you should learn just general principles and then derive information and knowledge, practice about particulars from that. And you can see what the basis for that might be. If we think of something like geometry or perhaps learning a language, you might start with these general principles and then use the general principles to arrive at conclusions about particular cases. But the other view is that no, we start with the particular and then we abstract and develop out of that general principles. That second view came to be the one that was adopted by the Jesuits, and it's one that is very interestingly expressed and developed by John Henry Newman in his lectures on the idea of a university. He thought, for example, that how college education should proceed is equipping people with powers of abstraction and analogy. So what he thought is this, is that you introduce people to whatever subject matter it may be. In one sense, it almost doesn't really matter where you start. I mean, it should be a worthwhile study, but wherever you start. And what you teach them to do is to abstract from their experience of different single, individual, particular objects, general ideas. So, for example, it might be that in a botany class you look at some flowers and then you try to extract from this general truths about flowers in general. And then he thought that having got to generality through the study of some particular field, you can then analogize, you can see, as it were, parallels between the general principles that you've discovered or abstracted in one field and apply them in another. And that this analogical thinking is extremely important. So the Jesuits in one way and John Henry Newman in another way, drawing incidentally on Aristotle, here devise an approach to education that says we start with particulars, things encountered in experience, and then we generalize and move to the more abstract. So these are contributions from within Catholicism to the idea of education in general. But what about if we pass to the idea of Catholic education? What is it that Catholic education specifically should be about? Now, I think in connection with this, we have to turn again to something in Aristotle, but this Aristotelian idea is one that is taken up, extended, and developed much further than Aristotle ever did by Thomas Aquinas. And that is the theory of the virtues. So, virtues are excellences, they're perfections of capacities. So I talked earlier on about the powers that characterize human beings. We look at our activities, we see what powers these activities express, what they tell us about ourselves, what our essential powers are. And the idea of a virtue is the perfection of a power. Now, of course, in this world nothing is perfected, but the improvement, we might say. So if we think about the four virtues that come out of Aristotle's writings and writings of the ancient world, they are those of justice, temperance, courage, and prudence. So in each case, what we're doing is we're trying to think about some area of human activity and try to see what would be a perfection of that. So let's take, for example, giving to people what is owed, the sphere of justice. Now, we might give to people what is owed to them in need, let's say, because of their material needs, their poverty, because of what we have a duty to provide for them. It might be actually punishment that is owed to people. But the sphere of justice is the development of excellence in relation to giving what is due or giving what is owed. Likewise, temperance is the virtue that's concerned with control, the control of the passions, of the desires, not the denial of them, not the attempt to annihilate them, but the management of them. And again, courage is that excellence or that perfection of our character that enables us to face danger. Not recklessness, but the capacity to pursue goods in the face of challenges. And then prudence here is a kind of master virtue that allows us to make wise judgment in the exercise of these other activities and capacities and excellences. But of course, part of a story about Catholic education is going to go beyond these general virtues to talk about the theological virtues. And the theological virtues are those of faith, of hope, and of charity. And of course, those are written about by Paul. But each of these is a kind of perfection or excellence that we're trying to achieve. In the case of faith, the excellence is the excellence of belief. That is to say, and the kind of belief that's in question here is not just believing certain propositions, but believing in God, rather as Abraham believed in God. It's a kind of trust in God. Talking about believe, not just believing someone in the sense of believing what they say, but believing them, having reliance or trust in them, having, as we say, faith in them. Or again, hope isn't optimism. The Jewish people are a hopeful people, but the Jews, history tells the Jews, they've got no reason to be optimistic, at least in terms of the relations of other peoples with them, if you think the terrible history that Jews have suffered, but nonetheless they have remained hopeful in the midst of all of that. So hope there doesn't refer to optimism, and for Christians, hope is rooted in faith. It's by having faith in God, trusting in God, that one then has hope. Hope not just that things will go well in the ordinary sense of that, but that ultimately salvation is offered to one and is available to one, and one hopes that one will secure it or be given it. And then again, charity is a perfection of an aspect of our personal being, love. The kind of love that's concerned here that we're dealing with here is a love that it looks at the other and is concerned for the good of the other. And again, because it's a religious virtue, it's related back to faith, that we are to love one another as we love ourselves for the sake of our love of God. That is, it's a fellowship, a solidarity with fellow creatures who share the image of God in themselves, and for whom we wish them, as we wish for ourselves, some participation with, or participation in, or union with God in the life of the world to come. So if we're thinking about Catholic education, nothing could really begin to seriously constitute a Catholic education that didn't find a place not just for the cardinal virtues of justice, temperance, courage and prudence, but also for the theological virtues of faith, hope and charity. Now, of course, there are many people who are in Catholic schools who are not themselves Catholics. And remember, of course, that Catholicism is not a sect. It wills the good of all, and it seeks to contribute to the achievement of the good of all. But insofar as it's specifically Catholic, it has to have a place for faith, hope and charity, and it has to think about how those are developed as theological virtues. And in doing so, it should return to where really we began in all of this, the idea of a one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That is to say, in developing faith, hope and charity, it should look to the experience and example of those who felt the unity of individuals bound together within a church, of churches bound together within the Catholic Church more broadly. It should feel the sense of holiness, that the pursuit of faith, hope and charity and of virtue more generally begins in the world but transcends the world. We're to be in it but not of it. That it is to be understood that through faith and hope and charity, the fullness of salvation is made available to us. And finally, that our confidence in these and the importance of the transmission and the cultivation of them goes back to our confidence that we are part of the Apostolic Church, the church founded by Jesus, given its mission to the apostles, and that we are, along with others, successors of those founding members. So, This has been our journey so far. There's a lot more that could be said, but I hope in the course of these 5 talks I've given you some sense of the Catholic contribution, both historically and in the present and as we go into the future. So thank you very much.